Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle by Betty McDonald, with thanks to Harper Trophy, an import of HarperCollins Publishers, for allowing us to make this recording. This is the Wellfleet Public Library for all the children and grown-ups of Wellfleet, especially the 2nd and 3rd grade classes of Wellfleet Elementary School. This is Chapter 3, The Answer Backer Cure. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Mrs. OToole put a peanut butter sandwich and a nice cool glass of milk on the kitchen table for her little girl when she came home from school. And pretty soon the front door slammed and in bounced Mary, her red braids switching like little ponytails. And her mother said, "How was school, darling?" And Mary said, as she gulped her milk and took a large bite of the sandwich, "Well, this afternoon, Miss Crabtree said, Mary OToole will stay in at recess and put the paint boxes away. And I said," and Mary took another gulp of the milk, "You're the teacher here, Miss Crabtree. Why don't you put away the paint boxes and let me go out and play?" And everybody in the whole room laughed but mean old Miss Crabtree, and she sent me into the cloakroom. And Mary took another large bite and looked up at her mother expectantly to see if she would appreciate how very smart she was. However, her mother said, "That was a very rude thing for you to do, Mary, and I am ashamed of you. When you finish your sandwich and milk, you had better go up to your room and stay until dinner. You can concentrate on how rude you were to nice Miss Crabtree." And Mary pulled her mouth down at the corners and squinted up her pretty brown eyes and said, "Why should I?" And she kept her mouth pulled down and blinked her eyes rapidly in a most disagreeable way. And Mrs. OToole was dumbfounded. Never had her little Mary acted in this horrid way before. And she said quietly, "You should because I tell you to. Now scat." And Mary walked slowly out of the kitchen, switching her skirt and her braids, and managing to look impudent even from the back. And when she reached the top of the stairs, she called down to her mother, "I'm going because I want to, but not because you tell me to." And she dashed into her room and banged the door. And that night at dinner, Mary was quite normal, but after dinner, her daddy said, "Scoot the dishes off to the table, wee one." And his dear little wee one, instead of jumping up and doing what she was told, pulled her mouth down until she looked like a sad jack-o'-lantern, squinted up her eyes, and said, "I'll do it because I want to, but not because you tell me to. Anyway, you eat here. Why don't you clear the table?" And she blinked her eyes rapidly. And her father looked as though he might be going to give her a spanking. But then he noticed that it was time for the news, so instead he went into his study, turned on the radio, and lit his pipe. Mary did clear off the table, and she dried the dishes, but she kept blinking her eyes and muttering. And the next morning her mother said, "Please hurry with your breakfast, Mary. The children are waiting, and you'll make them late for school." And Mary pulled her mouth down and began blinking. And she said, "I'm the one that's eating this breakfast, madame." She pronounced it madame. And Mary's mother sighed and said, "Whew, if you only know how unattractive you look and sound when you talk like that, you would stop right now." And Mary mumbled something into her cereal, then grabbed her sweater and slammed out the front door. And Mrs. OToole went to the telephone and called her friend, Mrs. Ragbag. And she said, "Hello, Mrs. Ragbag. Have you noticed any change in Calliope lately?" And Mrs. Ragbag said, "Well, no, I can't say I have, Mrs. OToole. She seems to be studying hard in school, and she eats and sleeps well. Have you noticed anything wrong with her?" And Mrs. OToole said, "No, it's not Calliope I'm worried about. It's Mary. Yesterday she came home from school, and she seemed perfectly normal, and she looked all right. But she told me how very impudent she had been in school. I punished her, of course. In fact, I sent her to her room to stay until dinner, but she was impudent to me, too. And she was rude to her father. I just cannot understand it. I thought perhaps all the children were acting this way. She pulls down her mouth, she squints up her eyes, and blinks. She looks hideous." And Mrs. Ragbag said, "Oh, I am sorry, Mrs. O'Toole, because Mary's always been such a dear little girl. I don't know what to suggest. Why don't you call Mrs. Keesop? You know what a problem her little Chucky is. She should have some ideas." And Mrs. O'Toole said, "Thank you very much, Mrs. Ragbag. I'll call Mrs. Keestop right now." So she called Mrs. Keestop, but she wasn't at home, and Nora answered the phone instead. And Nora said, "Sure, Mrs. Keestop ain't home, but how is that darn little Mary, the one with the beautiful braids?" And Mrs. O'Toole said, "Oh, Nora, that is just why I called. Mary has suddenly become so impudent. She answers back, and she pulls her mouth down and squints up her eyes and blinks. And she started yesterday, and I'm so upset. I called to ask Mrs. Keestop if she ever had any similar trouble with Chucky." And Nora said, "Sure, there ain't any trouble she hasn't had with Chucky. He's so rude he talks back to himself. But I'm thinking you best call Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. That woman has forgotten more about children than the rest of us will ever know. She even taught Hubert Prentice how to pick up his toys. Now that there is a spoiled child." And Mrs. O'Toole said, "Oh, thank you so much, Nora. I should have thought of Piggle-Wiggle in the first place. I'll call her right now." And Mrs. O'Toole called Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle and said, "Oh, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, I am so worried about my little girl Mary." And Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "I know Mary. She has such beautiful red hair and such lovely brown eyes." And Mrs. O'Toole said, "Well, she still has the hair anyway, but her eyes don't look pretty anymore. She squints them up, she pulls down her mouth, and then blinks." And Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "She answers back and is impudent, isn't she?" And Mrs. O'Toole said, "Yes, she is. But how did you know? I do hope that she hasn't been rude to you." And Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Oh, no. Mary's always very polite to me. But I can recognize the answer-backer symptoms. When was she first impudent?" "And yesterday afternoon, right after school," said Mrs. O'Toole. "She was rude to dear Miss Crabtree, her teacher, and when I sent her to her room, she made this hideous face and said, 'I'll do because I want to, but not because you tell me to.' And Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, she walks in such a way that her braids twitch, and even her back looks impudent." And Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Don't worry so, Mrs. O'Toole. Some of the most charming children I know were once answer-backers. Fortunately, Mary has only just begun, so she can be cured in no time at all. You drop by here after lunch, and I will give you Penelope the Parrot to keep for a while. Mrs. Garrison has been using Penelope, but she's had her for a month now, and Gary should be cured by this time. Now don't worry, Mrs. O'Toole. Penelope is a cure for even the most stubborn cases of answer-backishness." And Mrs. O'Toole hung up the phone, and she felt much better. Right after lunch, she went down to Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle's house and got Penelope. Penelope Parrot was a large, cross-looking green bird who blinked rapidly. And Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, as she handed the cage to Mrs. O'Toole, "Fortunately for you, Penelope will only talk to children." And during the walk home from Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle's house, Penelope was quiet in a very cross, blinky-eyed sort of way. And when Mrs. O'Toole hung her cage in the kitchen, she hunched down and put her head under the wing. But when Mary came in from school, Penelope woke up and began preening her feathers. And Mary was delighted with Penelope, and she said, "Oh, Mother, I've always wanted a parrot. Do you think she can talk?" And Mrs. O'Toole said, "She hasn't said a word since I brought her home, but I was told that she speaks only to children." And Mary said, "Where did you get her, Mother? Is she for me? May I have her in my room for my very own?" And her mother said, "I'm keeping her for a friend of mine, but when you play in your room, you may hang her cage by the window." And Mary brought her milk and cookies over by Penelope's cage, and was very surprised when Penelope blinked and said rudely, "Give me a bite, pig." And Mary broke off a piece of the cookie and poked it through the bars of the cage. She didn't know what else to do. And Penelope snatched it up and said, "Thanks, pig." And Mary turned to her mother. "She's certainly not very polite, is she?" And her mother said, "Perhaps she's been around rude people. After all, she's only a parrot and repeat what she hears." Penelope blinked her eyes and said, "Oh yeah? Oh yeah? Oh yeah?" And Mrs. O'Toole looked a little shocked, but Mary laughed and said, "May I bring the children in to see your mother? May I?" And before Mrs. O'Toole could answer, Penelope began hopping up and down, blinking and yelling, "Say, are you the boss around here? Are you the boss around here? Are you the boss around here?" And Mary's mother said, "I am the boss around here, Penelope, and if you are not more courteous, I will put a cloth on your cage." And Penelope blinked and muttered, and Mary bounced up and down excitedly. "What will that do, Mother? What will that do to Penelope?" And Mrs. O'Toole said, "If I put a cloth over her cage, she will think that it is night and I'll go to sleep." And Penelope squawked, "I'll do it because I want to, but not because you tell me to." And Mary was certainly surprised at that, because she thought that she had made up that rather brilliant remark. She didn't dare to look at her mother, so she put on her sweater and went out to find her friends. And pretty soon she came back with 5 friends, and they spent the afternoon standing around Penelope's cage and laughing at her rude remarks. And this worried Mrs. O'Toole. If Mary thought Penelope was so amusing, then perhaps she would imitate her and become ruder than ever. So she called Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. She said in a low voice so the children in the kitchen could not hear, "Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, I am rather worried because although Penelope is very rude to the children, they don't mind at all. Mary thinks she's very funny and laughs at everything she says." And Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Just remember, Mrs. O'Toole, that this is only the first day with Penelope. Let Mary be with her as much as she wishes. Keep Penelope's cage in the breakfast nook when Mary eats her lunch and breakfast, and in the dining room at night. Hang her cage in Mary's bedroom when she goes up there to play, and have Penelope sleep in Mary's room. I'm sure you do not have to worry. Penelope has never failed me." And Mrs. O'Toole said, "All right, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, I'll do just as you say. Goodbye." And just before dinner, Mrs. O'Toole said to Mary, "Mary, dear, send your little friends home now. It's time for you to set the table." And Mary turned to her mother and began pulling down her mouth, squinting her eyes, and blinking. But before she could say a word, Penelope the Parrot yelled out, "Say, who's the boss around here? Who's the boss around here? Who's the boss anyway?" And Mary's mother quickly put a cloth over her cage, politely asked the children to leave, and sent Mary in to set the table. When Mr. O'Toole came home from the office, she took the cover off again to show him the parrot, and then she hung Penelope in the dining room window. And after dinner, Mary's dad said, "Up on your toes, Miss Molly O'Toole, and scoot the dishes out to the kitchen." And Mary pulled down her mouth. She squinted up her eyes, blinked her eyes, but Penelope the Parrot beat her to it and said, "What am I, a servant? Work, work, work. What am I, a servant? Say, who's the boss around here? Who's the boss around here?" And Mary's father laughed so hard the tears ran down his cheeks, but Mary stuck out her tongue at Penelope, the parrot, who bounced around yelling, "Only snakes stick out their tongues! Only snakes stick out their tongues!" And Mary pulled her tongue in quickly and shut her lips together tight. My, but she thought that Penelope was horrid. And Mrs. O'Toole hung Penelope's cage in Mary's room, and Penelope squawked and made so much noise that Mary finally said, "Oh, be quiet." And Penelope blinked and said, "I'll do it because I want to, but not because you tell me to. I'll do it because I want to, but not because you tell me to." And Mary flounced into bed and turned off the light. And the next morning, Mary was very slow. She could not find one of her socks, and she couldn't button her dress. And finally her mother called, "Mary, hurry, dear, breakfast is waiting." And Mary pulled down her mouth and squinted up her eyes and said, "Oh, hurry, 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 hurry yourself." and Penelope had been preening her tail feathers. But when she heard Mary, she jerked her head up and said, "Ow! Hurry, hurry, hurry! Hurry yourself, Slowpoke! Hurry yourself, Slowpoke! Hurry, Slowpoke! Hurry, Slowpoke! Hurry, Slowpoke! Hurry, 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 hurry!" And Mary said crossly, "Oh, be quiet, Penelope." But Penelope the Parrot said, "I'll do it because I want to, but not because you tell me to. Say, who's the boss around here? Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah." And Mary ran downstairs and sat down to breakfast, leaving Penelope still shouting. But Mrs. O'Toole ran upstairs and got Penelope and hung her cage by the kitchen window. And when the children called for Mary, and Mrs. O'Toole said, "Hurry, dear, you'll make your friends late for school. Get going." Mary pulled down her mouth and squinted up her eyes and blinked. But before she could say a word, Penelope the Parrot squawked, "I'm the one who's eating this breakfast, madame. Hurry, 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 that's all I hear. Hurry yourself, Slowpoke." And Mary was ashamed to look at her mother, so she rushed off without kissing her goodbye. Penelope the Parrot yelled after her, "Hurry, Slowpoke, bell's ringing!" And when Mary came home from school that afternoon, she kissed her mother and said, "Mother, I apologized to Miss Crabtree today, and she said that next week I may be monitor for the scissors." And Penelope the Parrot yelled, "Who said so? Who said so? Who said so? Who's the boss? Who's the boss?" And Mary turned to Penelope and said, "You know, you are a very rude bird. If you don't hush right now, I will put the cloth over your cage." And Penelope the Parrot blinked and said, "Hush, hush, hush. That's all I hear. I'll do it because I want to, but not because you tell me to. I'll do it because I want to, but not because you tell me to. Who's the boss around here anyway?" And Mary's mother said, "I am the boss, and I think it's time you went home, Penelope. Mary, would you like to return Penelope to Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle?" And Mary said, "Oh, yes, Mother, and may I stay and play?" And Mrs. O'Toole said, "I think you had better come home and practice. Your music lesson is tomorrow, you know." And Mary started to draw down her mouth and squint up her eyes and blink, but suddenly she looked at Penelope, and so she turned up her mouth, opened her eyes, and smiled. And she said, "All right, Mom, I'll come home right after I return that rude Penelope." And that is the end of Chapter 3, The Answer Backer Cure.